Good morning, everybody, and thank you, Paul, also from me. So Richie mentioned about how you've kind of packed it in. That there's an expression, isn't there? If you want something done, give it to a busy person. But I think you stretch that to the absolute limit. How do you fit everything in? Where do you get your energy?
Well, it's not just about the amount of things, it's what you want to achieve. And then you have to look at the strategy on how can you best achieve it. What I found in Unilever was the first 5 years I had to spend a lot of time on getting Unilever going again and change the strategy and make the company successful. But then the second 5 years, I spent more time on driving these transformative changes that the world needs. And the COVID crisis really brings that home even more so. But then I discovered that, it's great if Unilever does all these things, but if we don't get the world to move at scale, we don't get the impact that we're looking for. So I started running the World Business Council and chairing that. Then I looked at the UN Global Compact, which has about 13,000 members. And then I took on the chairmanship of the International Chambers of Commerce, which is about 48 million members. So together with the WEF, ICC, UN Global Compact, the B team, the World Business Council, we have a good grip on the business community. Try to align the agenda amongst them, try to move them in the right direction to get this flywheel going. So that's one of the factors that I need. Then you have the second factor, which is you need the thinking and the intellectual capital. The Side Business School has people like Colin Myers, who just wrote this book on purpose, which is called Prosperity. And there's a lot of thinking there. I'm part of the Hoffman Institute and INSEAD on the board of the ESA. So I work on the academic side to be sure that we also get the input there. And then I created Imagine, which is really to look by industry, and we can talk about that later, get the CEOs together at critical mass to drive transformative change. So all of it goes in the same direction. I firmly believe that we are in a difficult period from a governance point of view, where it's increasingly difficult to solve these global issues in the absence of a decent structure of global governance. And I believe firmly that business needs to step up to fill that void and move into a more responsible business model. It has never been clearer in the last few months, obviously, but that is where I can, at this point in my life at least, make the biggest difference.
Paul, you mentioned so many different facets here around what, how you spend your time and the direction that you push in. What's the one thing that you would say keeps you up at night around the current situation?
Well, it actually boils down to the Sustainable Development Goals. The Sustainable Development Goals have as overall objective to not leave anybody behind. It's a plan to irreversibly eradicate poverty and do that in a more sustainable and equitable way. I personally won the lottery ticket of life. I grew up in a country where the education was paid for by the government, where I had, fortunately, food, so I didn't have to deal with issues of stunting. I had access to sanitation and clean drinking water. And as a result, I'm sitting here, but that's just a small minority in the world. I've done anything for it myself other than being born in the right place, in my case, the Netherlands. So we cannot make this world function if we don't fight for dignity and respect for everybody, equity for everybody. So what keeps me up at night is this drive and this need, this desire to create an inclusive world that functions now and for generations to come. And that's what we need to continue to fight for. I think COVID, more than anything else, has shown us the social inequality that is there in the world, has brought it to light even more so than many people were aware of. And if too many people in any system feel they're not participating or if they're excluded, they ultimately will rebel, and that's what you see happening in this world. COVID actually is a bigger challenge now, because we've seen really demand take off down, significantly down, and we see disruption in the way consumer spending patterns are right now, and as a result of that, you see this high level of unemployment. You saw the US figures yesterday, a 9.5% drop, was never seen before in the history of mankind. This is a crisis where we are creating and pushing back a lot of people again into poverty. Oxfam calculates about 500 million potentially. Unemployment will be high, especially amongst young people. So we need to focus on this social cohesion, on this inclusion, now a racial dimension to it as well, to be sure that we create as well that we can all live in harmony with our fellow citizens, but also with planet Earth itself.
So, Paul, you choose to put a huge burden on your shoulders. I think without comparison in many regards. So where do you get your optimism that all of these fights can be won?
Well, first of all, an optimist and a pessimist have the same life, but I've long ago discovered that an optimist has a happier life, and I prefer to have a happier life. If we listen to that little voice in our minds, which we've all done, myself included, that it cannot be done, has been done before, people don't care anyway, it doesn't make a difference, it doesn't lead to anything. You know, anytime you go into that direction and make your minds drift and try to find the easy way out, which is often an abdication of responsibility that you're trying to do, then the situation, gets worse. What we need right now is two things: optimism and hope. And I think it's that combination together with a certain level of courage that drives us to the changes that we need. I don't think it's all on my shoulders. I don't look at it that way. I just look at it as how fortunate we are to be able to make a difference. And actually, you know, some people think greed is good, but generosity is better. And I feel like if you live your life by investing in others, they will invest in you. And it's very liberating when you get to a point, and I'm lucky in that respect. So then you get to a point that you realize it's not about yourself, it's about investing in others. And by doing so, you're actually better off yourself as well. So it's a very fulfilling life. And the stronger your purpose is, which we're all working on throughout our lives, I think the easier it is to carry what some might see as a burden. I see it as a gift of being able to share, to help others. It's actually very selfish, by the way. It's not generous at all, because it makes us all feel good. And if we can do that and spread that goodness, which needs a certain level of optimism and hope, I think we can all make our own contributions in making this a better world and have a fulfilling life. And that's very satisfying. That's why we're here, after all.
Paul, you talked about, we are all seeking our purpose throughout our lives and careers. Take us back. I mean, about, or join some dots for us in your life, and in particular, how you ended up in the sort of positions that you had been. What were some of the lessons you've learned along the way? And did you ever want to become a CEO at the end of the day? How did that all happen?
Well, there's a lot in there, Richie. That's the topic for a few hours. So I'll try to do it very quickly. But I believe life is a little bit about serendipity. So and it doesn't go the way you plan it. I'm actually not a very good planner. But what I try to do is I try to look at create options, and then I pick one and don't look back. And the more you put yourself into things and be positive, the more you create options, I think. And then life is a little bit of serendipity. I couldn't have told you how my life would have gone. I grew up in the Netherlands, and in 1956 I was born, which actually, I thought it was a long time after World War II, but it actually wasn't. I just visited my 91-year-old mother last week in the Netherlands and dove back into the history of my parents. And because as you get older, you become a little bit more nostalgic. And what happened in the Second World War. My father was 15 when the war started. He was deprived of high school and basically education, and had to work very hard, in fact, in 2 jobs to ensure that his 6 children had a better life. He fought for a Europe with peace. He wanted to ensure that we all got a good education and had a better opportunity than they had. They met in Boy Scouts, so they were very closely in touch with Mother Nature, if I may say it that way. So that's how I grew up. And despite the limited means, they were always helping other people that were there. The church was a big part of that, as you can imagine. So that is my upbringing. Now, I wanted to be a priest first, and then I wanted to be a doctor. And I think it probably came from a desire to help other people. And, that was just one thing that very early on I felt was a good thing to do for myself. And that's why I concentrated on. But as it happened in Holland, there's a lottery on medicine, and I didn't get into that education. So my father made it clear that I had to make a living one day. So I ended up studying economics and wasn't very motivated, did that very quickly in the university in the Netherlands, but then moved to the US as I saw the opportunity. to explore another part of the world. But then I ended up at a university, met my wife, stayed there, did my MA, MBA, and ended up in business and made a career via P&G, Procter & Gamble, then Nestle as the CFO for 3 years and running the Americas for them. And then the CEO of Unilever. And that's purely serendipity. There's nothing else. All you have to do is, if you have that opportunity, is to be sure that you work on things that motivate you and that you find are useful. But I'm not a very good planner, and a CEO title doesn't mean anything. You can give anybody a CEO title. So that has never been my aspiration, and frankly, I wasn't looking forward to that. But when that opportunity came, I thought that was the right challenge. I'd retired before once, and I thought about getting out of these big multinationals, which have their pluses and minuses. But when an opportunity like that came along, I said, I'll do it for 5 years, and it ended up being 10 years. But I thought that was more than enough. And now into a next challenge, becoming a small entrepreneur again and trying to do what you guys are doing, which at my age is not an easy thing.
How's that working out for you, Paul?
Very good, but obviously COVID is not 100% helping us. But to some extent, it's increasing the market size and the awareness. But it's a lot of learning, to be honest, to build these companies and have the discussions with your lawyers and hire people and set up foundations and all the things that you take for granted when you have a battery of people working in your organization.
All the messy stuff, Paul.
Sorry?
All the messy stuff.
All the messy stuff, but it's good. I like to get my hands dirty as we work on this, and you probably, there's nothing wrong with that. And it's very satisfying if you can actually see the impact. I still have a little bit of convening power from all the other things I'm working on and from my career. And putting CEOs together is probably the biggest opportunity right now, and making these CEOs a little bit more courageous. And if you bring CEOs together across the value chain at critical mass, which we've done with fashion, which we've done with food now, which we're working on with finance, and once you get about 20-25% of a value chain together, you can actually drive tipping points. The CEOs together become more courageous. And if you have critical mass, you can actually drive the systems changes that we need. The problem with today's society is we have too many marginal changes within the system, but we are not getting to these bigger underlying things that need to change for our world to function. And that is what we are focused on. And that's very satisfying. A little bit more difficult on Zoom, but I'm actually very pleased because we have actually more access to people. You can now get 20 or 30 CEOs together on Zoom for an hour and a half, but it has its limitations. But we're moving forward fast. On fashion, we now have 67 CEOs, about 30 to 35% of the total fashion industry, working on net zero by 2050 on climate change, which is basically what we need to do to stay below 1.5 degrees warming, working on getting out of single-use plastics and looking at regenerative cotton, a very destructive crop from biodiversity point of view. But the interesting thing is, because these CEOs came together and the COVID crisis came, they also worked on the PPE material and started to work together, which they'd never done before. They worked with the ILO to put some standards out there on how they had to treat people in the value chain in countries like Bangladesh, etc. So other things are coming out of it. An industry that historically didn't work together very well is now rising to that challenge. So we feel good about that. We're proud of that. And the same thing on food. We're trying to see how we can make agriculture carbon positive. Right now, it causes about 20 to 25% of climate change. The biggest driver of that is obviously deforestation, food waste, our insatiable appetite for meat, and the way we produce this unsustainably. And at the same time, we keep the farmers in poverty. Most of the 820 million people that go to bed hungry are actually subsistence farmers, as you can imagine. So we're focused on livelihoods and try to improve that. And we're focused on getting our food and land use systems to be carbon positive. It could be about 30% of the solution. In fact, I would argue we cannot get to the 1.5 degrees if we don't take nature-based solutions into account. And the food system is the most important driver of that. So within a very short period of time, we are collectively tackling the food crisis in Africa, East Africa especially. They had locust climate change, COVID. We're looking at Brazil on how to decelerate the deforestation and the consequences of the Bolsonaro regime. We're looking at Europe and the Green Deal and how we can accelerate that. And when you have these CEOs together, you get access to people, you get others who want to join, you create that positive momentum that we should have in life. And that is where my optimism and hope comes from.
Wonderful.
Paul, you've mentioned COVID a few times. I just want to get your sense on the balance of that. So clearly it's a distraction and a disturbance, but also from my point of view has maybe given a bit more reflection time. And so the Black Lives Matter conversation has maybe had a bit more oxygen for that. So I'm drawing on James's question as well, which has been upvoted to the top. What are some of the positive aspects of COVID that you think will become a new norm?
Well, I mean, it is what it is. And like, I don't want to use the cliche, never waste a good crisis, but COVID is predictable. The black swan is not COVID. We've had SARS, we've had Ebola, we've had Zika, and now COVID. And they are all diseases that are coming from the animal world. And it's basically an encroachment by us on the natural world by destroying the natural world. So this is the particularly nasty one. We couldn't have designed a worse one than COVID. But we've had these pandemics every 3 years, and we're on course to continue to have those. The black swan here was not COVID, as I said, but was actually the inability of our global governments to cooperatively work together to do something about it. And it's silly to think that we are now post-COVID and how to go back to normal. First of all, pre-COVID wasn't normal. We were doing things that led to COVID. We were doing things that destroyed the planet at a much faster rate than the planet could replenish itself. And, we were on a trajectory of 1 million species becoming extinct. We were on a trajectory of 4.5 degrees on climate change. So COVID is a good warning. I think for the first time in a few lessons of COVID is that people now understand that you can't have healthy people on an unhealthy planet. And for the first time, people see better this correlation between biodiversity, climate, human health, the economy, now the social dimension and racial dimension added to it. So this, to some extent, the fact that it is more holistic, that it is actually complex, that a lot of systems seem to be breaking down, I think is actually positive. Because before COVID, we were making improvements, but we weren't going at the scale and speed. We were playing not to lose versus playing to win. We were doing baseline management. And sure, every company had a climate change plan, and every company showed that they were doing something about recycling or treating their people better. But collectively, it certainly didn't add up. So COVID has brought this broader awareness and a higher sense of urgency that we need to seek. The second thing that is good about COVID, if you want to, it brought to the foreground the social and now racial dimension as well. As I said before, any system where too many people feel they're not participating or excluded from will rebel against itself. And we've seen actually that the gig economy and all that left a lot of people vulnerable. Over 60% of the world population is in temporary jobs. And that's not even counting the 2.5 billion people that are in marginal jobs that don't even show up in the statistics. And what this crisis has shown is that the people we need most, the healthcare workers, the transport, the people that provide us food and work on the land, were actually the lowest paid. So hopefully we'll get some lessons for that and help us accelerate this new social contract. Moving away from this, from the few versus and moving towards the many. And we had created a society where you had islands of prosperity in a sea of poverty. But the people that were living in these islands of prosperity were building bigger and bigger walls around them and obviously protecting that status quo. Now we have this incredible transparency. So the second thing is a new social contract. The third thing that this crisis has shown is that global governance is failing. I mean, the situation with the governments, if you see how the governments like the US or Mexico or Brazil or places in other places, how they are handling this crisis, it has exposed the incompetence of many of them, if I may be unpolitical. It's not surprising that countries like Iceland, Norway, Finland, Denmark, Taiwan, South Korea, which are all led by women, are being held up as the best examples of dealing with this and getting the population behind them. Whilst the the authoritarian governments seem to have made a mess out of this and turned this into a political issue, which is to me quite amazing. So the third lesson is that our global governance need to drastically change as if we want to tackle these increasingly global issues what we have. And then the fourth and final lesson I would take out of this is that within this crisis, you've now seen a clear bifurcation that companies that are run under a long-term multi-stakeholder model, call it ESG, environmental, social, and governance, are actually companies that are doing better. First of all, they've had a better performance over the last 10 years, but more importantly also, they're better able to get themselves through the crisis. They have a more engaged employee workforce. When issues of mental health are coming to the foreground now, they seem to be doing better. Not excluded from it, but they tend to be doing better. They have better relationships with their suppliers. They often have a better financial situation. They haven't leveraged up their balance sheets to the tilt. And these companies are able to navigate these choppy environments, and I believe coming out stronger. And you see that happening, and that's not surprising as a result that you also see increasingly the financial market moving because they follow the opportunities. And these opportunities are clearly now towards these more responsible companies. So these are all the things that we need to think through and that we need to capitalize on in an environment that is going to be different. It's very hard to predict. I don't think there is a post-COVID. COVID will be with us for a long period of time. And you see that in the spikes coming back now again. And before we are able to find a vaccine that inoculates the total world population, because it is a global issue, it will take a while. And that's just the reality. So we have to live with a period with COVID. And I think there are three things that we know for sure in the sea of uncertainty. Is the first one is that technology will play a bigger part. We've accelerated in the last 3 months what would have taken us 5 or 10 years in many instances. The second thing will be a bigger role of governments. The governments have spent over 10 trillion just to stabilize these economies and will absolutely need to spend significantly more, if not the equivalent amount, to ensure that we get demand back and handle these issues of unemployment, etc. So you get a bigger role of governments. And then the third thing is a different environment on global governance that I talked about. So these things are definitely going to be the case, but how each company responds is difficult to see right now. But the companies that are operating under this multi-stakeholder longer-term framework and have a strong purpose, not surprisingly, will be the ones that will be clear winners. There's no question about it.
And Paul, you know, in terms of the multi-stakeholder organizations, in fact, Raju Nair's got a good question on that front. Now, you clearly have worked for some of the greatest organizations that have had that sort of movement at the heart of their DNA. So specifically to Raju's question, you've worked at some of the greatest FMCGs, P&G, Unilever, Nestle, etc., and they've all been very different in their own ways. So what would you say are some of the key takeaways, perhaps one for P&G, one for Unilever, and what are your sort of key learnings that you've had during the time there?
Well, I don't want to compare these companies right now because I won't make many friends in some and probably more friends in others, and that's not the purpose of this talk. But all these three companies are built to last. I've been very fortunate. You know, when I was born, the average length of a publicly traded company in the US was 67 years. And now that has dropped to below 17 years. So companies are not, you know, it's very rare to have a company that's around for 100 years or more. And these three companies do. And it's because they have very strong values, often going back to their founders. And they have a very strong purpose, different for all of them, you know, but differently verbalized. But it basically boils down to having a positive impact, solving the world's problems. Colin Meyer put purpose very well when he said the definition of purpose is to profitably solve the issues of people and planet. And I think these three companies that you mentioned have that very well ingrained. Their cultures are obviously totally different. The cultures are a function of the country you started in, your business models, some of the history with the founders. So the cultures are different, but the values and the purpose statements are pretty well aligned. And that's been a privilege to work for all of them. And I think these companies are not the ultimate of what succeeds. These companies were probably earlier in the CSR space, earlier in trying to be less negative, but I would not call out any of them as being positive. Right now, we have discovered that we have used more of the Earth's resources than we can replenish. We have discovered that our growth was actually driving more disparity, more income inequality, more exclusion. So now these companies need to look at their models as well and say, what can we do to drive it towards a positive impact? And that needs to happen in the next 5-10 years. We simply don't have more time. And are these companies able to make that transition, which is the most difficult one, requires the most courage, a level of discomfort, if you want to, going beyond the safe space? Are they able to do that? The future will tell. But that's their challenge as much as anybody else's.
So, Paul, I love the way that you don't pull any punches. So let's get a little bit controversial for a second. You said some things about Facebook. Would you like to expand on that?
Well, I've always said in the future, now that building on the previous question from Richie, Mark, companies, less bad is not good enough anymore. Less bad is still bad. Or thinking that you're good because you're not bad is not either right. You need to be good to be good. You need to be regenerative in agriculture. You need to be carbon positive. You need to be sure that you close the inequality gap. So most companies still stay in the CSR space at best, where they are taking responsibility of everything under their control, but it's very narrowly defined. In Unilever, the things under my control were only 4 million tons of CO2. But if I looked at the whole value chain and the effect we had on food waste or deforestation, or people taking showers at home and heating water, whatever it is, we had 400 million tons. So many companies still think that they can outsource their value chain and also outsource their responsibilities. So that's not anymore accepted. That's not accepted by the world population either. So if you go to Facebook, which has a lot of good purposes, Mark Zuckerberg's vision perhaps, and the people that work there of bringing the world together, creating communities, there's nothing wrong with that. But they refuse to take responsibility of their overall impact. If I am running Unilever, which I'm not anymore, and I produce a lot of plastic, then I'm co-responsible to solve the issues of plastics in the oceans. If my food production results in deforestation, the lungs of the world being cut out, then my co-responsibility is, and I say co because I might not do all these things, be able to do them alone, is to stop deforestation. And I think these tech companies are young. They've been very successful, but they haven't yet had their values and their culture firmly embedded. And it probably was the same when companies like P&G or Nestle or others started. So now they need to understand that they need to take the responsibility. If you take a platform out there and you put it out there and you earn money on that platform, but all of a sudden it becomes a platform for hate crime or a platform for division or a platform to undermine democracy, then it's your responsibility to ensure that that doesn't happen, because that's part of your impact that you have as a company on society. So you can think about this very simple. Most companies operate under a handprint. This is what I do, and you can feel my hand. And some companies say, I'll expand it to a blueprint. To a footprint, from a handprint to a footprint. That gets into your value chain. But then you have to move to the third phase, which is a blueprint, which is the whole holistic impact that a company has on society, including on the changes of consumer behavior. And I would add another dimension myself to that in the future that people haven't talked about, but increasingly coming out of COVID, I think a company also needs to have a heartbeat. We cannot distill this wealth into numbers and spreadsheets and computer models. We have to bring humanity back into all we do. And that is probably one of the biggest lessons from this crisis, if anything. So coming back to Facebook and your direct question, I wish they would proactively take a little bit more responsibility of solving the obvious. And living in California and being a billionaire makes it very difficult sometimes to figure out what the reality of the world is. And they've been a little bit myopic in that respect. I went a few times to the Consumer Electronics Show when I was running Unilever. And you had all these people in California running around trying to be the next billionaire with their most brilliant ideas. But they had never seen a poor person in another part of the world. Their sole goal was an IPO. and it didn't matter what, you know. And that's not how we can live life and live life successfully longer term. So you really have to go back to your purpose, your culture, your values, and reassess those. I'm sure Facebook is working those. I'm also sure they will figure it out. but right now they're certainly not on the right equation for the world. And in fact, the biggest change that is coming in these companies, believe it or not, is from their own employees. We are all first and foremost citizens of planet Earth, human beings. So if our company, as we've seen with Amazon, isn't aggressive enough on climate change, we go on strike. If our company is selling face recognition to the government and putting personal liberty at risk, we don't want to work there. If our company makes wonderful mattresses, but it sells it to the border control, which separates Mexican families from their children, we don't want our company to sell to them. And increasingly, you see this employee activism, which is going to be the biggest trend in the future. Companies, to succeed longer term, not only need to have this positive model, but you'd agree with me, they also need to have a very engaged workforce. You know, and that always was my number one priority in Unilever, to become the number one employer in most countries we operated, which we succeeded, and having an engagement score always in the top tercile, which we succeeded from admittedly a low base when I came. But that's the most important thing. So the biggest change will come, I think, actually more so than people realize, from this employee activism. And then Facebook is not excluded from that. So hopefully they take the lessons. Normally, many of these leaders have enormous qualities. You know, the Bill Gateses or the Mark Zuckerbergs have created companies because they had visions, but often they also have incredible shortcomings. You know, they are, I don't want to call out all the medical observations around these people, but they are often sometimes, I don't want to say often, they are sometimes not the most developed on their social coefficient. And I think there's some of the problems there at the top that need to be solved.
Yeah. Paul, what a comprehensive answer there. And I know I'm very conscious of time and your time. So I want to turn the conversation to you and potentially how you see the next couple of years play out for yourself. Perhaps what are some of the key things that you're hoping to achieve? I know we've spoken a lot about your various business activities, but sort of more holistically than that, what would be the next sort of thought processes you have over the next couple of years?
Well, in the spirit of my previous answer on your career, etc., I don't plan out for 5 or 6 years, but I need to have a little bit more balance. And I think the COVID period has allowed us to reassess how we work. I was going around the world, as you know, 80% of the time, living in airplanes. I had become a master in sleeping at night in airplanes, transporting me from one continent to the other so that I wouldn't lose any time. I think there's a little pause and reflection has been helpful to think how we can actually achieve more in a better way. I don't think we will be entirely want to be Zoomies. We all have learned how to do Zoom bombing and other things, but there is a limitation to that. But I think there's a little balance that has to come back to that. And it also provides space, then it provides space to read a book, to exercise a little bit more, to work more with your family, because you actually have to, and I've been very bad at that, may I say, but you have to invest in your own sustainability as well if you're preaching sustainability to the world. I've always thought that was selfish to spend time on yourself, but actually it's actually not. You need to invest in yourselves to be able to do much more in all the other things that the world is asking for. But then, I come back to the same thing. I've been very fortunate that I'm in a position to do something about it at scale. And it wasn't my own doing. It was just by sheer luck, by winning the lottery ticket of life in terms of my birthplace. And so I will continue to be driven by putting myself to the service of others as long as they need it. And I think the next 10, 15 years, when hopefully my system up here and physically works still, I'm not someone who likes to sit on the beach and just go around. I get my satisfaction of changing the things that we now need to change so that we can be proud and look our children and my grandchildren in the eye and say, yeah, we did make a difference. We didn't leave you with a mess. And spend more time there, probably more time on the youth and empowering the next generation, creating the next cadre of leaders that we need to pull forward. That's why I'm so much into the education side. What's the future of the MBA and how do we drive these schools forward is a very big part of that. The youth now, if you look at people below 30, it's 50% of the world population, but they're still excluded from many of the things. And now we're settling them with another $10 trillion of debt, or probably more, most likely. And yet we still don't include them. It's their future. And it's silly just to give them only the problems and to pile them up and now adding the debt to that. We need to be sure that we make them inclusive. So as an SDG champion, as chairing the UN Global Compact for the Secretary General, I will certainly look very hard on how we can continue to make the SDGs come alive. Climate change and inequality being the biggest drivers, but also with a strong component on including the youth. And as it happens today, I have a webcast with the YPO, the Young Presidents Organization, and with Nexus. Nexus is a wonderful organization of the younger people that are the children of high net worth individuals. It is what it is. But they are often much more purpose driven, and combined money that is now within that group, I think, is 25 to 30 trillion. And if you can get that generation to shift and change, yeah, you can move mountains. And that's probably a good thing if we can leverage that force. So I like to focus on those things.
So, Paul, you said something quite profound there, that we can all look our children and grandchildren in the eye. That's a bit of a hairs on the back of your neck moment for me anyway. Turning to our audience then, what's the one thing that our audience should look to change?
Well, it's not for me to tell everybody, because the audience, the fact that you're here is because you care. You get up early, you're on the line, you're probably doing amazing things already, but you need to get out of the comfort zone. Don't play it for safe. If you have the answers, you're probably not ambitious enough. What you ever do right now is very much appreciated, and I want to thank you for that in the name of all these people who probably are too hungry to do that themselves. But you need to set your ambitions much higher. And whatever level of you're in your organizations, whatever role you play in society, you can influence your circle of influence if you want to. And with that positive force, you'll see your circle enlarge. And bit by bit, you see your impact that you're having becoming bigger and bigger as well. But this is not a moment for the faint-hearted. This is not a moment for your own egos. This is not a moment to play it safe. We really have to get out of that comfort zone, as I say, and become these bolder and braver and more courageous leaders, driven by a strong sense of purpose, understanding that putting yourself to the service of others is also to your own benefit, thinking multi-generational, and starting to force these enormous partnerships that we need to solve the problems that we have. You know, Einstein said it very well when he said that the definition of insanity is to do the same thing over and over again and expecting different results. We need to start to do things differently. And this partnership for the common good, intergenerational partnership, is a big component of that. It's hard work, but it's rewarding.